Coming up on New Day at Arirang, South Korea is set to report some 190,000 new COVID-19 infections Monday, showing a significant drop. Authorities say the peak of the infections has passed, but the advent of the stealth Omicron is becoming an outlier. As tensions continue in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky says the country is prepared to discuss adopting neutral status as part of a peace deal with Russia, but it would have to be guaranteed by third parties and put to a referendum. And President Moon Jae-in and President-elect Yoon will meet for dinner tonight for the first time since the election. The agenda has not been set, but Yoon's spokesperson said discussions would naturally include current affairs.
Hello and welcome to this Monday edition of New Day at Arirang. I'm Mark Broom. Thanks for joining us for another week.
And I'm Kim Mo-gan. It's 8 a.m. in Seoul, Korea, March 28th. And over the next hour, we'll take a look at the big news stories of the day and get expert insights on issues facing Korea and the world.
We certainly will. We're going to start with the COVID-19 situation in South Korea. The number of new daily cases is still well in the hundreds of thousands, but the country has been on a downward trend for the past couple of days. Despite the weekend effect of fewer tests being conducted, authorities are still cautiously suggesting the country has possibly passed the peak in terms of Omicron.
Yet they remain on high alert with the rapid spread of the highly transmissible subvariant of Omicron, BA.2. For more on this, our reporter Choi Min-jung is here in the studio with us. Good morning, Min-jung.
Good morning.
So let's start with the local infections for today.
Mo-gan, cases have been dropping for the past couple of days, and today we're expecting it to drop to somewhere in the 200,000s. From midnight to 9 p.m. Sunday, South Korea saw close to 184,000 cases. We saw a drop of a whopping 126,000 cases from the same time the day before. The tally for this time period has been on a downward trend since hitting a record high of more than 300,000 cases 2 weeks ago. We usually tend to see fewer cases on Mondays as fewer people get tested for COVID-19 over the weekend. But we will have to wait and see if cases will remain on this downward trend later in the week. Health authorities have been saying that infections are declining overall after cautiously declaring that Omicron wave reached its peak around 2 weeks ago.
Okay, so it's a good sign that we seem to be on this downward trend now. However, looming in the background, there's this so-called stealth Omicron BA.2.
Right, Mark. We know so far that stealth Omicron, also known as BA.2 variant, poses the same level of threat to people's health as Omicron. But what's concerning is its infection rate. Stealth Omicron spreads 30% faster than Omicron, and it's already making up more than 40% of infections. Now, because of this, some experts predict that the current wave will last longer. And this has already been the case in Europe, where countries like Germany, France, and Italy have been seeing an uptick in infections driven by the BA.2 variant. Health authorities will be announcing details on the current spread of the subvariant later today, along with forecasts on the country's virus situation.
Now, Min-jung, a new COVID-19 oral pill, Lagevrio, has been available in South Korea since Saturday. So how did the rollout go?
Well, around 20,000 courses of the pill were distributed to designated hospitals and pharmacies on Saturday. And a pharmacy in Seoul received enough courses to treat 20 people, but said they hadn't received many prescriptions for Lagevrio yet. And this could be because Lagevrio is recommended as an alternative for COVID-19 patients who cannot take Paxlovid due to health issues. Lagevrio was shown to be around 30% effective against hospitalization and death, compared to 90% for Paxlovid. But experts still say it could treat those who have underlying diseases related to the liver or kidney. And the introduction of Lagevrio is expected to ease the shortage of COVID-19 oral treatments, as some 7,000 people are prescribed with medication each day. And to overcome the shortage, officials are planning to bring in a total of 184,000 courses of oral pills by the end of this month, and another 276,000 courses in April.
And starting this week, from Thursday, I believe, South Korea will permit COVID-19 vaccinations for children between the ages of 5 and 11. There are a number of parents here in South Korea who are skeptical about having their children take the shot, but how are parents in other countries reacting?
Right, Mark, as you said, vaccinations for children aged 5 to 11 will begin this Thursday, and there are debates over the safety of the vaccines for young kids. But there are countries that have already begun inoculating this age group much earlier than South Korea. The U.S. began administering shots from November last year, and the vaccination rate for children has surpassed 30%. It did start off slow, but has begun to pick up pace. The majority of the side effects that were reported were mild, including fever and a headache. According to the CDC, the vaccine is relatively less effective in preventing infections compared to other age groups, possibly because they are given smaller doses. But medical experts still recommend shots for children as they reduce hospitalization by 74%.
All right, Min-jung, thank you so much for your report. We'll talk to you again this week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Now, staying with COVID-19, but further afield, China has announced its biggest citywide lockdown since the emergence of COVID-19.
Shanghai is being locked down in 2 stages over 9 days while authorities conduct thorough testing. The country's financial hub has been battling a wave of infections for nearly a month now. The lockdown will see Shanghai's eastern section under restrictions from Monday until April 1st. The western part of the city from April 1st to the 5th. Public transportation is suspended while firms must halt operations or have their employees work remotely. Now, turning to the latest in regards to the war in Ukraine, it's already been more than a month since Russia invaded the country. Despite the humanitarian crisis worsening by the day, the rising death toll, as well as unrelenting shelling and airstrikes, Russia and Ukraine have reportedly agreed to hold a 5th round of peace talks, this time in Turkey. Song Yoo-jin reports.
It's been over a month since Russia launched a full-scale attack on Ukraine. Over the course of that time, Moscow and Kyiv held 4 rounds of peace talks aiming for a ceasefire, but which all ended without a major breakthrough. The two countries are now looking toward fresh talks in Turkey. A Turkish presidential spokesperson told CNN that the talks are expected to be held in Istanbul on Tuesday. However, that date may change as a negotiator from Ukraine earlier took to social media to say that the meeting will run from Monday to Wednesday. During the talks, Ukraine could lay out the possibility of neutrality as well as coming to a compromise over the status of the eastern Donbas region, which is controlled by Russian-backed separatists. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke of the possibility in a video call with Russian journalists. Zelensky stressed that although his country is open to becoming neutral, any agreement would have to be guaranteed by a third party and put to a referendum. Meanwhile, over in the battered country, one survivor from the theater bombing in Mariupol 2 weeks ago told the local media outlet Sunday Local Time that the attack resulted in the deaths of numerous pregnant women and infants, though the exact number was not given. This was because the shelling struck the area of the building that was being used to shelter mostly women and babies. The survivor also estimated that at least 300 people would have lost their lives, matching the preliminary death toll announced by city officials. And Ukrainians are not only facing the risk of death, but also deportation to Russia. Citing data from Russia's National Center for Defense Management, Ukraine's human rights ombudswoman claimed Monday local time that Russian forces deported more than 19,600 Ukrainians, including some 3,000 children from the separatist regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. However, she added the actual number is expected to be higher as Russian troops are kidnapping civilians all across the country. Ukraine's foreign ministry previously announced that a maximum of 400,000 Ukrainians may have been forcibly taken to Russia. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang News.
The head of the IMF is warning the economic strain caused by Russia's invasion of Ukraine could ignite civil unrest in the Middle East and beyond. Speaking at the Doha Forum on Sunday, Kristalina Georgieva said The war and sanctions imposed on Moscow have forced the world's poorest to bear the brunt of the crisis as they grapple with severe inflation and job insecurity. She also called for global cooperation to fill the gaps in commodity and energy supplies, citing Ukraine's importance as a top global wheat exporter. The IMF chief pressed for a swift resolution to the war. Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into the biggest news stories in the spotlight right now. South Korea is continuing to experience one of the biggest surges in Omicron cases anywhere in the world. That being said, as we just heard from our reporter earlier, there was a dip, or is expected to be a dip, on Monday. And South Korea's New Delhi infections on Sunday were well below 400,000 for the fourth consecutive day. But unfortunately, the numbers still rather depressingly high. The number of critically ill also at around 1,200. This is putting extra pressure on an already strained healthcare system.
Experts say the country experienced the peak last week when the daily count spiked to over 620,000. But there are still fears of another spike due to BA.2, a subvariant of Omicron. For more on where South Korea stands in terms of COVID-19, we connect to Dr. Alice Tan, internist at Ms. Mary Women's Hospital. Good morning, Dr. Tan.
Good morning.
So let's start with the subvariant. It's generally accepted that people who've recovered from the first strain of Omicron have built up natural immunity. But can they still catch BA.2? And can we expect similar symptoms with the initial strain?
Right, the symptoms of BA.2 do seem to mirror those of BA.1. Very severe sore throat, headache, fever, chills, muscle aches, some gastrointestinal symptoms in terms of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Some reports have been made about dizziness, but we're not sure if that's secondary to dehydration because of vomiting and diarrhea, or if there's a primary problem going on either in the vestibular center of the ear or the brain. In terms of protection, there was a study from Qatar that showed that prior infection with BA.1 offered 95% protection against infection with BA.2. However, the reverse, so infection with BA.2 seemed to only offer 85% protection against BA.1. So in terms of reinfection risk, it is possible, but the risk is much lower for the two Omicron variants.
Okay, that's good to hear. I had Omicron last week. Hopefully I got BA.1 rather than BA.2. The big news related to vaccines this week is from Thursday. Children will be permitted, providing they get parental consent, of course, between the ages of 5 and 11 to get a shot against COVID-19. As we heard from our reporter, there are a great many parents in South Korea who are really skeptical about giving their young children this COVID-19 vaccine, considering that a lot of kids have already had COVID-19 and they generally recover much quicker, and there's very rarely that they ever go to hospital or anything like that. So do you see many parents taking their kids to get vaccinated? And there's also the concern in so much as that we know the short-term risks aren't particularly that large with the vaccine, but there are some things we definitely don't know at this point in terms of the really long-term effects, possibly, of these vaccines.
Right, so the hospital where I'm at, we're going to be starting vaccination in children between 5 and 11 in a few days. So I haven't seen the rush to get children vaccinated. I understand that there is a lot of hesitancy among parents of children in this age group, but let's just break down what we're talking about in terms of the safety, the efficacy, effectiveness, and what we're dealing with in terms of risk. In terms of the safety, there was a report by the U.S. CDC after 8.7 million doses of the COVID-19 vaccine by Pfizer was administered in children between age 5 and 11. And what they found is that this vaccine is very safe. There were 3 reports of death, among the 8.7 million doses delivered. One child had influenza at the time of death, and 2 children had very complicated medical conditions that were underlying their health conditions. Also, in terms of efficacy, we know from the phase 2-3 trials that the vaccine is 90.7% efficacious in terms of preventing symptomatic COVID disease. And then in terms of real life effectiveness, the vaccine was found to prevent hospitalization in this age group by 74%. So it's very efficacious and effective. And in terms of the risk, what we're dealing with here in Korea, we need to realize that up until Omicron, there were 3 deaths in the pediatric population. Since the onset of Omicron, that number has nearly quadrupled, and 11 children have died. In terms of who is dying in that pediatric population, 9 out of the 11 deaths occurred in children aged 9 and younger, so unvaccinated children. And in terms of severe complications, we know right now there are 20 children in ICUs. That's more than any number that we've seen up until this time. And there have been also 16 cases of multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children in ages 12 and below in Korea. This is a potentially fatal condition, very serious. And so we know as Omicron keeps on spreading among children that there will be more cases, more hospitalizations, perhaps more cases of MIS-C, and unfortunately, there may be more deaths as well. And we want to be able to protect our children. Any number of deaths in children is too many. And I think that's the reason why the U.S. CDC, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the government of France, many countries around the world are encouraging parents to get their children who are aged between 5 and 11 vaccinated against COVID-19.
Right. Dr. Tan, also, considering that there are some 2 million people being treated at home due to COVID-19, and many of them are possibly fully vaccinated, how much do you think that there will be hesitancy among some people to get their booster shots because of this?
Well, we have to understand what's going on. Basically, there's waning of immunity. After 3 to 4 months of the second dose, the protection level goes down. And because Omicron is so good at evading both vaccine-induced and natural infection-induced immunity, we really need that third dose. We need that booster to get our protection levels back up. And most of the people that I know who've had breakthrough infections, they go through the infection, they feel the symptoms, they have fever, muscle aches, cough, the worst headache of their life, a burning sore throat, and they tell me they are so glad that they got vaccinated because they are really aware that it could have been much worse. Once they feel just how strong COVID-19 can be, even with having had 2 vaccines in their system, they are very thankful that they got vaccinated. They regret that they were not boosted. And that's the opinion that I've heard from many adults. And so that third dose should not be considered as an option. It really is necessary to get our immune levels up to where they need to be against Omicron.
Okay, really quickly, because unfortunately we are running out of time, but I have to ask you this because we're going to be into our 3rd summer shortly of wearing face masks outside here in Korea. Many countries have scrapped them. In just 30 seconds or so, when do you think it's going to be sensible for South Korea to say, look, it's just an individual choice whether you wear masks outside? I'm not talking about inside here.
Right. Well, summer is 2-3 months away. If we don't have a new variant, I think we will be able to bring our transmission levels low enough and have our hospitalization rates low enough, enough space in our hospitals to deal with the load of new cases, that we may be able to take our masks off outdoors. But we have to remember in the Seoul metropolitan area, it is such a highly population dense area. Sometimes it's very hard to keep a safe distance from strangers. And so hopefully we'll be able to have a maskless summer outdoors this year, but we will have to see.
Well, let's hope for that. Dr. Tan, thank you so much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
South Korean President Moon Jae-in and President-elect Yoon will meet Monday for the first time since the election. Officials said Sunday that they're going to have dinner at the Blue House, accompanied by their close aides. President Moon had expressed hope for the meeting, and the president-elect responded that he'd like a candid conversation. The agenda has not yet been set, but Yoon's spokesperson said discussions will naturally include current affairs. Their meeting comes 19 days after the election, delayed likely because of politically sensitive issues. South Korea's President-elect Yoon, who takes office in May, will send a delegation to the U.S. in mid-April to discuss the alliance and other global issues. Yoon's spokesperson said Sunday that the 5-member team will meet with officials from the Biden administration, Congress, and U.S.-based think tanks. The goal is to hold practical and comprehensive talks over national security with the people who actually made the decisions in the U.S. The team has yet to be finalized, but it will be headed by lawmaker Park Jin of the People Power Party, who played a key role in laying out Yoon's pre-election foreign and national security pledges.
South Korea and the United States have concluded North Korea's it disguised last week's launch of an existing ICBM as that of a new and larger one. They believe the missile launched was a Hwasong 15 instead of the Hwasong 17 that the North claimed it had tested. Kim Hyo-sun with more.
South Korean and U.S. intel agencies believe last week's ICBM launch by North Korea involved a Hwasong 15 missile. According to multiple sources, the Hwasong 15 was disguised to look like the newer and larger Hwasong 17, which is dubbed by watchers as, quote, a monster missile. The Allies' joint analysis was based on input from intelligence assets and shows the missile had 2 engine nozzles, like the Hwasong 15 the North test-fired back in 2017. The Hwasong 17 has 4 nozzles. The analysis also showed the engine combustion time of the first-stage rocket was similar to that of the Hwasong 15. However, military authorities noted the missile fired last Thursday flew a similar trajectory to the Hwasong 15 test-fired 4 years ago, but at a higher altitude and for a longer distance. South Korea's military intelligence also believes the launch video later released by the regime was actually a patchwork of earlier footage from the previous tests of Hwasong 17 variations. On a related note, North Korea may be preparing a nuclear test as it seems to be working on a shortcut to a tunnel at its nuclear test site in Punggye-ri. If the North goes ahead with the provocation, it would be Pyongyang's first known nuclear test in 4.5 years. According to South Korean government sources Sunday, it has detected signs of the North restoring Tunnel 3 in the mountainous northeastern region. Against such a backdrop, pundits say the regime may test a small tactical nuclear weapon that can be loaded onto ballistic missiles sometime around April 25th, a key national holiday commemorating the founding of the Korean People's Revolutionary Army. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
And now we cross over to our Oh Soo-young for a global insight and an in-depth look at important developments in world affairs.
Thanks very much, Morgan. It is indeed time for Global Insight. South Korea's President-elect Yoon spoke with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping on Friday, marking the first interaction between Seoul's incoming administration and Beijing. Their conversation lasted 25 minutes, touching upon bilateral ties ahead of Yoon's inauguration on May 10th, as well as cooperation on dealing with a nuclear North Korea. While the agendas seem to stick to formalities, many are questioning how South Korea and China's relations will change once Yoon takes office, as he has shown strong support for Washington amid its strategic rivalry with Beijing. We discuss what may be on the cards, and for this I'm joined by Ramon Pacheco-Parde, Head of International Studies and Professor of International Relations at King's College London. We're also joined by Robert Ross, Professor of Political Science at Boston College and Associate of the John King Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. A very warm welcome to you both. And well, beginning with you, Professor Pacheco-Parde, it's lovely to see you again. Well, South Korea's President-elect Yoon spoke with Chinese President Xi Jinping on the phone on Friday. I wonder what you made of the conversation and how you think that Beijing is really perceiving the conservative President-elect's win.
Well, I think it was interesting because this was the first time that a Chinese president spoke with a president-elect, so before the president actually took office. So I think this underscores the importance that both countries give to the bilateral relationship, but also the importance that China, and Xi Jinping in this case, gives to having good relations with the incoming president. I would assume that China isn't particularly happy with the election of the new president. Candidate, when he was candidate, Yoon Suk-yeol, he made clear that he wanted to take a tougher approach on China. But having said that, during the last 2 years of the Moon administration, relations between South Korea and China have really nosedived. There has been criticism from South Korea, from President Moon himself, about the way China dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic. South Korea has been participating in maritime exercises together with the U.S., the Quad countries, with other countries as well, such as Canada, for example, or European countries. And more generally, we have seen a deterioration in relations, both diplomatic relations and security relations between South Korea and China over the past 2 years. And I think this is likely to continue under President-elect Yoon once he takes office in May.
And Professor Ross, well, President-elect Yoon Suk-yeol, he did indeed pledge to strengthen the South Korea-US alliance and diversify South Korea's trade, reducing its dependence on the Chinese market. And well, how do you think that Yoon Suk-yeol's electoral victory has been received in Beijing?
I think the Chinese see the last 5 years as successful for China. They've had a president in South Korea who basically had the same policy toward North Korea as China did, and who worked hard to cooperate with China and North Korea. And the 3 no's that President Moon offered China back in the beginning of his term were reassurances to China that South Korea would not cooperate with the United States against China. So the status quo was the last 5 years, and they're going to watch very carefully what President Yoon does, particularly with respect to missile defense, cooperation with the U.S.-Japan alliance. Should he move South Korea in a different direction and collaborate with American Indo-Pacific policy, its containment with China, its security relationship directed at China, I think South Korea can expect some significant retaliation. Of course, it was quite painful last time, both the economic sanctions China imposed on South Korea, the heightened military presence in the Yellow Sea, and second time around, China may say, well, perhaps South Korea hasn't learned the lesson. We care about these things deeply. And so perhaps should President Yoon return to President Park's policies on missile defense in particular, and the U.S.-Japan alliance, we might see even stiffer economic sanctions.
And of course, South Korea has been in a state of dilemma for quite a while, having to always being pressured to choose between its greatest security partner and its largest trading partner. And while Professor Pacheco-Parde, Yoon appeared to have sided with Washington amid this US-China competition. But is it realistic, though, to expect Seoul to make a deliberate turn away from Beijing, given its economic ties and, of course, the issue of North Korea? Or do you think Yoon is going to have to maintain a certain level of strategic ambiguity in handling the South's relations with Washington and Beijing?
Well, I think President-elect Yoon has made clear that he's going to try to cooperate with China and North Korea, and this came out from the call that he had with Xi Jinping as well a couple of days ago. I mean, the peak in relations between South Korea and China was really 2013-15 under President Park, when she signed the FTA with China, when she visited Beijing for the celebration of the end of the Second World War, the anniversary of the end of the Second World War. And since then, relations haven't really recovered to the good times, really, from that period, 2013-15. So I would assume that under President-elect Yoon, we will see Korea continue to move closer to the U.S., closer to other countries, for example, Europe. There has been a strengthening relations between Korea and Europe in recent years, and one of the key reasons really has been to contain China. So I would assume this to continue. I think that President-elect Yoon, he may try to indicate that he's not willing to side against China, but I don't think his actions will actually follow from his words. In the same way that President Moon over the past couple of years hasn't even talked really about the strategic ambiguity, because I don't think China thinks this exists anymore in South Korean foreign policy. And I think this is going to become clearer under President-elect Yoon once he takes office, and he's going to be more vocal really in criticizing China.
Professor Ross, well, for years, South Korea has been trying to gain the support of China in dealing with North Korea's security issues. But it seems now that Beijing and Pyongyang are closer than ever before. Do you think China is going to be at all instrumental in dealing with these security issues? And do you think it's even interested in North Korea's denuclearization at this point?
This is an interesting question. So in the past 5 years, China, particularly the last 2 or 3 years, China has expanded trade relations with North Korea, interrupted by the pandemic, including investment relations have improved. And ironically, that is what South Korea itself wanted to do with North Korea, only to find obstacles indeed from the United States under the Trump administration and some reluctance under the Biden administration. So it's not quite accurate to say that China wasn't helpful, because it was actually South Korea's policy as well. Now, of course, the one exception is the last few months, last year or so, with North Korea doing more missile testing. One might expect the Chinese to put some pressure on North Korea to cease these operations. But I think they're done helping, if you will, the United States in its North Korea policy. The United States puts economic sanctions on China, technology sanctions, a global coalition against China, improving relations with Taiwan, while the South Korean government is increasingly recognizing the rise of China, cooperating with China. China is much less reluctant to say, we need to be on the side of the United States in putting pressure on North Korea if we want to have good relations with South Korea. I think China is more confident now that South Korea is facing much more constraints, and regardless of China's North Korea policy, South Korea has to find a way to get along with China, particularly when they both see engagement with North Korea as the only reasonable, realistic path forward.
Professor Pacheco-Pardo, South Korea and the US are expected to strengthen their bilateral alliance under the Yoon administration. And the President-elect, he's mentioned placing additional anti-missile defense systems in the country. Do you think North Korea's recent ICBM test is going to strengthen the case for this? I mean, what kind of ways do you think Seoul and Washington are going to strengthen their security alliance? That's to you, Professor Pacheco-Pardo.
To conduct tests, the stronger the case for that deployment to continue. There is also talk about, of course, about greater intelligence sharing on China, not only at the bilateral level, but also trilateral intelligence sharing, including with Japan. And there is also talk about a nine-country alliance, of which Korea would be part, together with some other Indo-Pacific countries, also European countries, to share intelligence on China. So what we see here is that this is becoming more multifaceted. I also would expect Korea to be more open about its participation in joint maritime training exercises, which are really targeting China. And South Korea might be also willing, actually, to participate in freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea and be vocal about its participation. So in a sense, not only deploying its military assets, but openly discussing and saying that it is cooperating with the U.S., with Indo-Pacific countries, also with European countries, in trying to contain Chinese behavior. So I think we're going to see a broadening of the scope of cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea to try to contain China, along with other partners, but also South Korea being more open about the type of activities that it is doing.
So we're seeing more like-minded countries continuing to work closer together based on shared values and liberal values, of course. But at the same time, Professor Ross, there are growing concerns that the likes of China, Russia and North Korea are going to work together to weaken America and its alliance, and that Pyongyang testing its ICBMs might not necessarily be a bad thing for Moscow and Beijing. What do you make of this view?
Well, first, I want to say once again that should South Korea find itself participating, let's say, in freedom of navigation operations or a vocal voice against China and containment with the United States, they would be the outlier for the most part in East Asia. Singapore, Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, none of these countries participate in freedom of navigation operations. None of them have a vocal voice in supporting containment. So if South Korea went out on that limb to be consciously supporting American containment of China, I think South Korea would be in for a rough ride. Now, yes, the United States is finding itself in a difficult situation in dealing with China, North Korea. The Ukraine situation has preoccupied the United States, and other countries are taking advantage of it, including Iran, including China, including North Korea. And they're all benefiting, if you will, from the war in Ukraine. The United States has been trying to pivot to East Asia since 2010. Every time it tries, it gets drawn back into Europe or into the Middle East or the Persian Gulf. And this is happening once again. So even for this reason alone, these countries are less inclined to cooperate with the United States because they're finding the United States less able to compete with China, with North Korea in East Asia. Now, for North Korea's part, what a perfect time to increase testing when America is preoccupied elsewhere. Regarding Sino-Russian cooperation with North Korea, now Russia's not really a player here, never has been a player. The 2+2 talks no one ever suggested Russia should be part of them. But to expect greater Chinese cooperation with North Korea, I think it's going to move ahead quite quickly as the pandemic winds down. Trade is going to increase, investment will increase, because China and South Korea, under the Moon presidency, agreed that engagement was the best way to deal with a nuclear power, because over the long term, both countries agreed North Korea was not going to denuclearize, so you had to get in there with your trade, with your investment, with your tourism, and gradually moderate this system. And that's been Chinese policy. It's been engagement, just the United States engaged China, just as the Obama administration wanted to engage Cuba. And this was the Moon policy, and I expect this to go forward. Is this cooperation against the United States? I don't think so. I think this is just recognizing the reality of North Korea as a nuclear power, which China sees its government as somewhat unpredictable and wants to use trade and investment to try and moderate its behavior.
Professor Pacheco-Pardo, I wonder what you think about this, about Moscow, Beijing and Pyongyang working a bit closer together, and also what you think North Korea's next steps are going to be.
Well, from a European perspective, it's been quite interesting to see Korea has been one of the very few countries really across the world that has supported the sanctions on Russia, right? We have, of course, Japan, Taiwan, and Singapore in Asia, but no other Asian country is actually trying to support Europe, the U.S., as they try to help Ukraine in its fight against Russia. So I think this has actually, in my view, this has indicated that within Korea, not only the current administration, because this was part of the campaign, there has been this shift towards making values actually more important as part of the foreign policy, because Korea is actually taking an economic hit from supporting the sanctions. Korean chaebol are actually suffering in the bottom line because of their supporting the sanctions as well. So I would expect that with President-elect Yoon taking office in a few weeks' time, that we will see more of this, that we will see more of Korea siding more openly with the United States, with European countries, with like-minded countries, as you put it before, and willing to take the economic hit as it is doing right now. Of course, China has far stronger relations with South Korea than that Russia does, right? But having said that, we have also seen South Korea trying to diversify its economic relations towards other countries, for example, in Southeast Asia. So I think if South Korea is able to somehow manage this, it would be in a better position to withstand the economic sanctions that no doubt would come from China if South Korea becomes more open about its support for the U.S. containment policy.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, so this is where we'll have to leave the interview. That was Ramon Pacheco-Pardo, Professor of International Relations at King's College London, and Robert Ross, Professor of Political Science at Boston College. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Parkinson's disease slowly robs patients of control of their body. The incurable disorder particularly threatens aging societies like South Korea, so doctors here have made it a top priority. Our Han Sang-woo takes a look at how it's hoped detecting Parkinson's early will transform the way the illness is treated.
Parkinson's begins long before the first tremor. And by the time the symptoms are obvious, it's often too late to hope for any meaningful change, a significant loss of brain cells and damage having already occurred. That's why the fight against this incurable disease depends so much on detecting Parkinsonian symptoms early to potentially slow its progression. Professor Byun-sun Jung from the Catholic University of Korea, Uijeongbu St. Mary's Hospital has developed a unique way to accomplish that, using artificial intelligence to analyze the gait or walk of someone at high risk of Parkinson's or other neurodegenerative brain disorders, using an insertable shoe sole with multiple sensors.
I gathered data between September 2020 and last December, a few months short of a year and a half, from a pool of around 350 senior citizens over 60 years old. And among them, data from 75 people with Parkinsonian symptoms, along with 82 healthy individuals without symptoms, for a grand total of nearly 8,700 steps, all with their own diverse gait indicators, were incorporated into the algorithm I developed.
She's already filed a patent application for the machine learning algorithm and hopes to hear good news within a year or two. Byun says it boasts a 98.1% accuracy rate in differentiating between healthy older adults and those suffering from Parkinsonian symptoms, and an 83.2% accuracy rate in distinguishing whether those symptoms are vascular or neurodegenerative. Far more accurate than initially projected, the results fuel expectations that once it is authorized for clinical use, gait analysis could drastically save patients' medical bills by eliminating the need for MRI and PET scans until when they become absolutely necessary.
If Parkinson's disease is indeed the case, dopamine medication will help patients immensely. But if it isn't, in other words, if it's vascular Parkinsonism or a whole separate illness like spinal stenosis that causes their short steps, there's no point in prescribing the drug. It won't work and will only expose them to potential side effects. Differentiating between these patients using conventional methods is quite a struggle. It's practically impossible for doctors to run MRIs or PET scans on them every time the need arises.
It would also be a breakthrough for people like 75-year-old Park Kwang-chun, who's been diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment with Lewy bodies. At a glance, he walks fine, a bit slow given his age, but otherwise steady. So it's people like Park who may fly under the radar when they should be undergoing targeted treatment.
I was told Parkinson's disease is something I may have to face in the future, and I was afraid. I have friends suffering from it, you know. They're seriously ill. Before I end up like them, assuming I do get diagnosed one day, I'd want to delay its progression for as long as possible with proper medication.
Declining motor functions aren't the only signs of the devastating illness, though. Parkinson's, according to research done by Professor Lee Ji-young at the Seoul National University Borame Medical Center, may one day also be detected by observing structural changes in the retina.
Parkinson's disease is mainly characterized by the degeneration of dopaminergic neurons in the brain. But the same thing happens in the retina as well. What happens then are irregularities in the synapse network that transmits visual information. This can lead to dull vision, mistakes in color perception, and even difficulties in adjusting to changes in light when outside or in a dark setting.
Yi, along with several co-authors, recently published their work in Nature Review's Neurology, writing that the progressive thinning of the retina provides potential biomarkers for diagnosing Parkinson's early. She calls retinal scans a promising tool to aid the diagnosis and management of the disorder.
The orthodox theory is that in the end, the layer of optic nerves, known as the ganglion cell complex, shrinks to the point that its total thickness is greatly reduced. Clinically speaking, the thinning correlates with how severe the Parkinsonian symptoms are. But the phenomenon's only found in certain areas. In other words, there are some parts of the retina that thin out and other parts that don't.
Yi believes that with additional research and cutting-edge technology, retinal imaging will eventually offer a safe and scientifically significant solution to the over-reliance on brain scans.
Commercializing the method would give prospective patients a non-invasive and radiation-free way to detect the disease. For the medical community, it would signify a tremendous advance in health science, the confirmation of a pathophysiological mechanism between the retina and the brain.
Both Pyun and Yi's findings are part of the Korean medical community's efforts to address an illness that will become more common with longer life expectancy. Those battling the disease in Korea, home to one of the world's fastest aging populations, see early detection as a stepping stone towards more sustainable long-term care.
Without even knowing I had Parkinson's, I had MRI scans on my brain, neck, and waist. And the one for my brain cost me nearly $1,200. If easier methods like walking examinations and eye scans are made available, we won't have to spend as much. I'm all for early detection.
The earlier Parkinson's is detected, the better. Therapy goes much smoother in the early stages. It's when the disease is discovered too late that problems arise.
It's tough on people at an advanced age to receive news they've been diagnosed. Once people enter their 60s, the passion for work wears away, leaving them psychologically vulnerable. So detecting it early when they're young is good. It offers patients a soft landing.
The Korean Parkinson's Disease Association stresses, though, that while early detection is crucial, the timely prescription of medicine and exercise must be accompanied by a shift in public perception towards viewing Parkinson's patients as productive members of society. 한성우, Arirang News.
And now for a look at news from around the world, we turn to Lee Seung-jae, who's standing by at Arirang's newsroom. Good morning, Seung-jae.
Good morning to you guys, and of course, welcome back, Mark.
Well, SJ, thank you very much for filling in for me last week. I appreciate it. But let's start in China. The country is mourning the victims of a recent plane crash there, and we are hearing that the jet's second black box has now been found.
That's right. So China on Sunday held a memorial event at the crash site of the China Eastern Airline flight MU-5735 to, of course, mourn the loss of the 132 people on the flight. Now, attendees at the memorial included Chinese State Councilor Wang Yong and rescue team members who observed a moment of silence for the 123 passengers and 9 crew members. Now, the memorial event comes a day after authorities confirmed the deaths of all 132 people on board the ill-fated plane. Meanwhile, like you said, the plane's second black box was recovered Sunday morning as search and rescue operations entered their 7th day. Now, the first black box, believed to be the cockpit voice recorder, was recovered last Wednesday, bringing investigators a significant step closer to finding the cause of the tragedy. Now, Yemen's Houthi rebels announced a 3-day ceasefire with the Saudi-led coalition on Saturday, voicing their commitment to a permanent truce if the coalition ends airstrikes and withdraws their forces. Now, the ceasefire agreement includes the suspension of all ground battles across the front lines. Now, the Houthis also proposed a prisoner swap deal, which would include the brother of the Yemeni president. The Houthi proposal came hours after coalition forces launched heavy airstrikes on the rebels' vital military and economic sites in retaliation for missile and drone strikes against oil facilities in Saudi Arabia last week. Now, meanwhile, El Salvador's Congress on Sunday approved emergency powers to temporarily suspend some constitutional protections after the country recorded a sharp rise in homicides linked to criminal gangs. Now, on Saturday alone, police reported a total of 62 homicides, the highest daily toll so far this century. Now, the emergency measures include restrictions on free assembly and the inviolability of correspondence and communications, as well as an extension of administrative detention. Now, the surge in homicides comes despite a steady decline in such figures since President Nayib Bukele took office in 2019. And finally, Hollywood is counting down to its biggest night of the year, with the 94th Academy Awards set to kick off in Los Angeles. Now, this year's event marks the first time since 2020 that media and celebrities have been allowed to mix. Now, last year's Oscars was a remote event held at Union Station in downtown Los Angeles due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, as people are allowed to return to the event, strict protocols have been put in place with at least 2 mandatory PCR tests and a proof of vaccination for all on-site personnel. Now, the Academy Awards will air from 5 p.m. Sunday, local time.
Good morning. Picture-perfect early spring weather is on tap for the start of the last work week of March. One thing though, big gaps in readings between lows and highs will continue, so do dress accordingly on your way out. Thick morning fog is covering inland regions. Drive with care. Keep a safe distance while driving. Morning temperatures in most parts are 4 to 7 degrees lower than Sunday morning, but it is so bright outside. In fact, sunny skies will be featured all day, and highs will be a couple of degrees higher in central regions, but lower in the south compared to yesterday. So most areas will be going up to 14 to 15 degrees Celsius this afternoon. Air quality will be normal to good as well nationwide. So weather-wise, today could be by far the most pleasant day this season, so enjoy. Up and down temperatures to stay, while nationwide rain is in the forecast to end March. With that, here's a look at the weather conditions around the globe.
And that's all we have for now. Mark and I will be back for another episode of New Day at Arirang at 8 a.m. Korea time Tuesday. I'm Kim Mo-gyan.
And I'm Mark Broom. Have a great day, and thank you as always for joining us. Until next time, goodbye.
Everyone knows I'm passionate. Know why? Look at how passionate Koreans are. And you know I'm fast. Don't blink. Koreans move fast too. I'm creative on the pitch. People say I'm smart. Just look how smart Korea is. I aim to be spectacular for the